Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from the Gorillaz, Song Machine Season 1 Strange Times. This was an album that I was looking forward to a lot because I'm a big fan of the Gorillaz and I quite liked a lot of these singles leading up to this thing. Though I should probably explain some of my history with this group, especially over the past couple of releases from them, really since the band had their big comeback back in 2017. That comeback record, Humans, was a project that overall I enjoyed a lot more than most people did. In fact, I think it's a pretty decent record overall, but I certainly did have my problems with it. Lots of those problems are the very same problems that lots of other people had with that record, most notably the fact that the core band themselves didn't really have that big of a presence on that record. It felt like it kind of seemed like most of the features on that project were very overbearing. There was a lot of them. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work quite as nicely, but at the end of the day, you ended up with a record that I thought was pretty okay, but was kind of awkward for the group. And then you had the Now Now in 2018, which is a record that I enjoyed a fair bit more than Humans, actually, even though it was a bit more simple and stripped back. I felt like that's what made that record work. The limited features on the thing, I think, helped that thing really shine, though I can understand why some people didn't really care for that project all that much, especially given how, using different features and styles of music and incorporating them into the core Gorillaz sound has always been something about this group that people really love, and the Now Now was kind of lacking in that regard, which is something I can admit even though I really like that release. But here on this new record, it seems like the Gorillaz are back in peak form almost, because they have a lot of what made their music in the days of Demon Days and Plastic Beach, for example, really stand out and sound really great. Most notably, that mixture of genres and the use of features to really interesting effect is on full display here on this record, much like on those couple of releases I mentioned before, and much unlike the past couple of releases from this group. Before progressing any further in this review, I should probably clarify that I'm only talking about the standard edition of this album here today. Not to say that the bonus tracks aren't worth checking out, but I only review standard editions of projects and reviews, and that's going to be the case here as well. But the sound of this record is one that, like I said before, sees the band experimenting with a lot of different ideas, like on their best releases of the past. Of course, you have that core kind of indie alternative rock sound that the band brings, mixed in with all kinds of R&B, hip-hop, rock, pop, among other things here on this project to make a really interesting project. One thing I was kind of expecting from this record, in a not-so-good way coming into this thing, was for this thing to maybe feel a bit disjointed, given the release schedule of this project just involved lots of singles from this thing dropping, and I figured that maybe given that these songs were made to be singles originally, they wouldn't fit together all that nicely, but that's not really the case here at all. I mean, I wouldn't say this is the most cohesive Gorillaz record that we've ever gotten, but with the exception of a few moments on this thing that I'll talk about later on, I feel like for the most part Strange Times is a really cohesive project that flows together quite nicely too. And I also really appreciate how all of these songs on this thing, despite every track here having some kind of feature on it, these features never completely dominate the tracks that they appear on and take away from the core band themselves. It seems like on pretty much every song here, the vocals from 2D are very apparent at least one point on the track, and the instrumentals to this thing just feel very Gorillaz-like in nature. On Humans, for example, I feel like the instrumentals on that project, while mostly enjoyable, sometimes I feel like they existed more so to fit the featured artist than the band themselves. Not really the case here on this project. A lot of these instrumentals feel very Gorillaz-like in nature, and yet they complement the artists that appear on these tracks really nicely as well. For example, one of the tracks that I think showcases this feature best is the song Pac-Man, which features Schoolboy Q on it. The song starts off as this kind of dancey, upbeat, electronic track with 2D doing his thing on the vocals, and then Schoolboy Q comes in later on in the song doing his rapping, and I really like how both 2D's vocals and Schoolboy Q's vocals here on this track are very different when it comes to their delivery, yet they both pair up with the same instrumental here really nicely. It's one of those things that Gorillaz did really well on some previous efforts, but I haven't really seen from them in like a decade or so at this point. So hearing it again here on this project is just really nice to see. The track The Pink Phantom is another moment on this thing that really showcases the band's genre experimentation and feature collaboration game really nicely, because this track just has a lot going on in it from a vocal standpoint, in terms of the instrumental and the overall feel of this track, it's this pretty simple ballad song, but I really like how each vocalist here brings their own unique thing to this track. You have 2D's typical sleepy vocals here on this thing, which I really like. You have Black that comes in with this more modern R&B sound to his delivery, which I thought was really nice. And then you have Elton John doing his thing as well. And I really love how each of these vocalists sounds absolutely nothing alike here on this song, but they all come together to make something that feels very cohesive and natural sounding. It reminds me of a lot of really interesting genre experiments from the band in the past, maybe not necessarily in the way that there's a song in the band's back catalog that sounds exactly like this one, but more so just in the sense that the band is reaching out to artists that you typically wouldn't expect to see together, putting them on a song with the core band sound, and just making magic happen. The song Momentary Bliss on this thing is in the moment that sees the band experimenting in really interesting ways. Of course, you have the core Gorillaz band doing their thing really nicely, but I also like the really punky guitars that pop up at certain points on this track. I really like Slow Tie's rapping here on this thing too. He sounds very forceful, he sounds very direct, he has this punky energy to him that pairs up with the instrumental really nicely. Overall, just a cool moment from the band that, again, sees them pairing up with some artists that really complement their sound in really unique ways. Of course, not every song on this record tries to have multiple featured artists on it and multiple sounds or anything quite like that. Sometimes it's just one artist and one other sound that the band is trying to reach out to, but even in these cases, they still do it really nicely. Probably the finest example of this is the opening track on the record, Strange Times, which features Robert Smith doing some of the vocals, and he brings this nice kind of dark gothic energy to the track, which is something that I feel like the band has never really explored before, but they do it really nicely. His vocals pair up greatly with 2D's really sleepy vocals. They have a lot of good chemistry here on this track, and the hook to this song is really catchy too. It's a great start to this record all around. The song The Valley of the Pagans with Beck was another song on this thing I was looking forward to quite a bit, given that, much like the Gorillaz, Beck is another figure in music who's kind of eccentric, a bit weird when it comes to the different kind of genres he likes to experiment with, and seeing these two team up together, something interesting was bound to happen, and this song ends up being a pretty enjoyable song, all things considered. I mean, sure, it's not as wild or out there as maybe it could have been given the two artists involved here, but I still think this is a really, solid track through and through. I like how fun it is, I like how it keeps the energy going after the first song on the record, and there are some really catchy moments on this track too that I really liked. In addition to some of the more upbeat moments on this thing, like The Valley of the Pagans or Momentary Bliss, you also have some slower moments on this thing too, whether it be the song The Pink Phantom, which I talked about before, or the third track on the record, which I also really like, The Lost Chord. I really love the melody here on this track. The kind of dreamy atmosphere the song has to it is also really great. Just another really standout moment here on this thing. When it comes to complaints I have with this record, there are a few. Nothing really all that major, but just a few things here that kind of bugged me while listening. For one thing, while I do think the song Momentary Bliss is a great track, I don't think it really works as a closer all that nicely. Like I said before, it's this very energetic song that I think feels more appropriate towards the start of the the middle of the project, but not really towards the end, and especially not as a last track. I feel like the last song on the record should really encompass a lot of what the record is trying to do conceptually or sonically, and this track doesn't really do either of those things. I mean, it could be worse. I mean, like I said before, this is still a really great song on its own, and that alone still makes it an enjoyable listen, but it does leave the end of this record feeling kind of awkward. It just kind of feels like the album stops rather than having an actual finish to it. The track Friday 13th featuring Octavian is one of the weaker moments on this thing in my opinion, mostly because this is an instance on the record where that balance between the core band and the featured artist isn't really at its strongest. Here on this track it feels like the featured artist is really just in the spotlight of this track, and the core band is not really as present here on this track. It feels almost more like a Humans cut in that regard. Fortunately though, this track, as it is on the record, still ends up being a really good song, mostly because Octavian's performance here on this track is really great, and the instrumental to this track is really solid too. I mean, it's a really solid track through and through, even if it does feel kind of out of place when it comes to that balance I mentioned before. It could be worse, again, because, like I said, the track itself is still really enjoyable. And my final kind of complaint with this record is something that has more to do with the record as a whole rather than any individual song, and that's just that lyrically and thematically, I felt like this record is probably one of the weaker in the band's catalog. I'm not sure if it has to do with the fact that this album's release was a bit different than their other records, with the tracks coming out every few weeks or so, and, with all the features. Maybe because of all of that, they couldn't have a super cohesive idea to this record, but for whatever reason, the lyrics on this record just did not jump out to me in the same way that they did on some of the band's best releases in the past. And yeah, even records like Humans, for example, was a record that tried to do some big things conceptually. I don't think it succeeded for the most part because of some of the faults that that record has, but at the least it kind of tried for something overall, whereas I feel like here on this project, thematically it's just a bit more aimless. You'll have some tracks going for social commentary, like the opening track, for example, Strange Times, which will also have some more personal tracks on this thing too, like the Pink Phantom, and none of these really come together overall to make some kind of big cohesive statement or anything like that. It just feels like a collection of tracks in that regard, which is something the record manages to avoid from, a flow standpoint and a sonic standpoint, but from a lyrical standpoint, it does kind of seem like this thing was patched together from a bunch of singles. That's the only part of this record where that feels to be the case, which honestly is probably the best of those categories for that to feel the case in, if that makes any sense, but still, it is a bit of a letdown, especially considering that some of the concepts on records like Plastic Beach and Demon Days were really great and really ambitious, and the way that they were executed was part of what made me super invested in records like those. But this record in comparison, sure, there are some individual tracks on this thing that I think the lyrics to are really great and interesting, and they have some interesting ideas going on in them, but as a whole, it doesn't feel like a cohesive experience from a thematic standpoint, which I guess is a little bit of a disappointment. Again, it's not that big of a problem in my opinion, mostly because the individual songs on this thing are so strong, but yeah, it is a minor complaint that I have. Overall, though, the complaints that I have with this record aren't anything that gets in the way of my enjoyment of this thing, because like I said, at various points already here in this review, this feels like the Gorillaz have returned to their peak form in many regards. That balance between the core band and the features and all the genre experimentation has been brought back to the point where it's just at its best, I feel. Everything just pairs together so naturally and nicely here on this record. The band is able to mix together many different ideas and sounds and genres into very cohesive tracks that flow together to make a mostly cohesive album too. The performances from the band themselves is at their best here in years on this project too. 2D's vocals sound really excellent here on this thing. He has those really sleepy, drowsy deliveries that I really love from him, and there's so many great catchy moments that he's able to get across through his vocals on this thing too that I really like. And the instrumentals here are fantastic as well. It really feels like every member of the group has their own thing going for them in the instrumentals of these tracks. It doesn't feel like on Humans where it didn't really feel like a real group behind a lot of the tracks. Not the case here on this record. This feels like a real band, and of course you have the features coming in too, and while there are plenty of them here on this record, and while they do come from various different genre backgrounds, they're all able to bring so much greatness to the tracks that they appear on here in this record, and there wasn't a feature on this thing that I was disappointed by. Overall, this ends up being probably my favorite release from the Gorillaz in this new era of the band since their comeback in 2017. It just feels like the classic Gorillaz have come back to us in the form of this record, because it just has a lot of those elements of those older projects that I really liked when it came to how the band, tied everything together from a sonic standpoint and when it comes to the features and all of that. So, yeah, this was great. I'm excited to see more of this in the future, and I'm guessing we're going to be getting more of it in the future given the whole Season 1 part of the title here. There's probably going to be more of this to come, and I'm really excited for when it does, because if it's more like this, it'll certainly be great. But yeah, that really sums up all my thoughts on this project. If you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on this record in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like album reviews, countdown lists, discussion videos, things of that sort. Again, thank you guys for watching, and stay golden.